So our next panel is what we call the Trainee Roundtable. And I have to say, in past workshops where it's applicable that I've organized, I've always tried to have trainees have a chance to say something, because we always get very interesting input from our trainees. So if they would all come up, I'll just say who they are as they walk up. Cheryl London we've asked her to chair this. And Cheryl's from Ohio State, Tracy Baker from University of Wisconsin, Pierre Camazzoli from the Smithsonian, Julita Ramirez from the University of Washington, Robert Redhune from University of California, Davis, and Katie Sheets from North Carolina State. And I would just say that several of these folks are obviously not trainees now; they're very well established. But we thought it would be useful to kind of have a mix of current trainees and past trainees to get their input on their training experience, and in particular the relationship of One Health to it. So
I have a few slides that I
sure.
just put together on them.
Yeah.
So let's see if this. So I guess I'm officially a senior person because I turned 50 and got my AARP card in the mail. And I actually refused to fill it out, to fill out the form, so I just kept getting them. Apparently they're very persistent. So I just put a few slides together, just sort of give my perspective. There's only 3 slides, so on sort of where we're at and what some of the challenges are. And I think mainly, or most of these have already really been discussed. And I sort of am speaking from the perspective of somebody who's a clinician on the floor and also has a research lab and runs a clinical trials office. And this is sort of my perspective, and I think it's something that we've come to understand, is that when you look at the body of students that enter veterinary school, 80% or more of them are tracked to general practice. They come in tracked to general practice. Most of them are small animal practice. Some of them are large or mixed, but the majority of them in their mindset aren't really thinking about alternative careers in veterinary medicine. They are your typical students who have finished their undergraduate and worked in a local practice or on a dairy farm, and that's how they've gotten the majority of their experiences, and that's what they're tracked to do. And so they do get intermittent exposure to their to alternative careers during their training, but it's not sustained. So they may do a summer research program that lasts for 6 to 8 weeks. They may do an internship here or there, but the majority of their experience is didactic with respect to what they're trained in. And most of that's learning basic physiology of multiple species and then trying to translate that into clinical understanding and clinical practice. And so they don't really get what I would consider sustained immersion in alternative career paths. They get sort of intermittent bits. And most of our students have sort of a pack mentality, which is all of them are really doing spinal animal practice, so that's what all of them really want to do. And so they tend to cluster in groups that way, and it's very hard to sort of get them to think outside the box. And the other sort of issue that we face in veterinary medicine is that any sort of advanced training can seem daunting to many of these students because their debt load is so incredibly high when they graduate from veterinary schools. It ranges from $150,000 now to $300,000 because so many of them are going in through private veterinary schools. And so if you come from one of the island schools, then those students have $300,000 in debt when they graduate. And so that's essentially like having a mortgage that with no house to show for it, and they have to figure out how they're going to pay this off and how are they going to do this if they enter advanced training. So when we think about veterinarians doing a combined DVM PhD program, there are a few places that have done that well, but for the most part, most of our universities aren't training lots of combined DVM PhD students. So most of them come from a track where they've either done their veterinary degree first and then decided they want to go on and finish a PhD, or you can do what I did, which made most of my family members cry and not understand why I couldn't just make some money, which was to do a DVM, do some practice, residency, and then a PhD. So that's an incredibly long career training period before you actually get into your actual real career. And then So those tracks are uncommon. And then what's more common, at least in the anatomic and clinical pathology field, is that those veterinary students will finish up their training and then immediately go into a path residency. That's a combined PhD program. And so those are well ingrained. We have a really successful one at Ohio State. And many of those DVM, PhD, anatomic path trained residents go into careers in industry. And they're very well paid, so they do incredibly well. But the challenge that I sort of see is in this sort of long linear training that makes it's really daunting for many students. So support for advanced training can be limited. It can be really hard to find funds to support those students. The MSCP requires at least 1 year interruption of training, 2 year interruption of training potentially. That can be challenging given the structure of the DVM program. So I was initially involved in when it was the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, scholar program, and when we had just opened those up to veterinarians, we got very few applications, and it was very hard to encourage veterinary students to apply for those because the notion that they would be disconnected from their classmates for a period of time was challenging for them. And part of that is the way the curriculum is structured, which is very intense didactic learning over 3 years. They basically immerse themselves in large volumes of information that needs to be covered in a relatively short period of time. And this volume of information has gotten even larger over the past 10 years. And it leaves them little time for other activities, so they don't have time to do bench research. So the thought that they'll interrupt that didactic portion of their training is daunting for many of them because it separates them from their friends and it sort of separates the continuum. And although we've started to get our veterinary students into the clinic earlier in their training, the majority of their training is really compressed into about a 10-month period in their senior year, and that's what they get before they graduate. Many of the fellowships that are available that could support postdoctoral training, et cetera, are really restricted to MD qualified applicants. So that would be enormously helpful if some of those restrictions could be removed, so to include veterinarians in that. And there are a number of awards that can support advanced training, but many students are really not aware of those opportunities, often until it's too late and they've already committed to smaller practice and they say, well, it's too late for me to consider this now. So I think, we've thought a lot at Ohio State about how we change this paradigm, and I don't think there are any easy answers. But I do think that one of the things we have to do is engage these students from day one and not engage them intermittently, but engage them in a very sustained manner so that they get exposed to what the sort of realm of veterinary medicine is and how veterinarians can contribute to research. And, as somebody who's sort of taken the long career path, I love science. I think science is incredibly cool, but I also think what's amazingly cool is to be a clinician that can impact outcome, not just in animals, but in humans as well. And as the focus has really sort of transitioned from trying to just train bench research physicians to training individuals who really are translational, that can see a phenomenon in the clinic, can go back to the bench and then bring that back in. What we need really are to train good clinician scientists in veterinary medicine as well. I think there's enormous value in having a clinical skill set and in addition to your bench skill set. And so in order for us to sort of inspire that sort of learning, I think it'd be great to get these students into internship opportunities in pharma industry and the NIH during their training, not just for a couple weeks in the summer, but trying to integrate that into their training program so they're doing it in a more sustained manner. To have career counseling not in the last year of their training, but to start on day one so that they're interacting with those counselors at the very beginning so that they can start to explore these alternative career paths. And then mentorship is really important. I think none of us would be where we are without mentors who inspired us to really choose these alternative careers. And so we need to focus on getting experts within our institutions and outside our institutions to volunteer to be mentors to help grow this set of experts. And again, really the sustained contact with prospective trainees. And I think one of the things that we've tried to do at Ohio State is to integrate a residency PhD program into the training. So there's a great advantage to having a specific skill set and a specific medicine or surgical background, but also being able to integrate that with a true PhD. So we've now got a couple of successful residency PhD combined programs, and that's great for them because it shortens their timeline of training. So they're not doing a residency for 3 years and then doing a PhD for another 4 or 5 years. And this is outside of the anatomic path realm. So we have a couple in our medicine residency training program. We have 2 in our oncology training program that have entered a residency PhD program. And so I think maybe that's one way we can start to capture a skill set of translational scientists by offering or trying to structure financial support for those combined residency PhD programs that allows them to complete their residency and a PhD program in a compressed period of time, and then they can transition to a true translational scientist. Any other? I'll open up the floor. Does anybody have any slides or anything? Okay, so why don't we go through and everybody can sort of give their experience and their.
Right. My name is Julita Ramirez, and I'm in the Lab Animal Medicine Residency Training Program currently at the University of Washington. But I'm also, as we all are here, K Award recipient, and so I am in my 3rd year of support, actually just beginning my 4th year, and so I mostly do research. But my background was really kind of different. I came in more as a person interested in basic science before I was even interested in veterinary medicine, and knowing that I was going to do basic science no matter what. And then veterinary medicine was something I got interested in later, sort of as the translational aspect, as you were saying. Well, you really have to know, and also loving animals, of course, and wanting to be a part of caring for them, but more in like, well, in order to solve these problems, you really have to have kind of a holistic view of things, would really help. So that's sort of how I got in kind of on the other end. And then sort of the whole DVM PhD thing is I did a combined program at Colorado State, and that was sort of me not being able to choose between doing a biochemistry PhD and the veterinary medicine program. So I sort of just coordinated both of those because I just wanted to do them. But it, as you say, is rather unusual that way, and I'm so glad nowadays that I've really seen real advances in funding for DVM PhD programs, and more support for those. And increase in funding, of course, is really important because, as you state, the debt load is quite frankly paralyzing for most of us. And I also want to stress it's not just professional education; it's also undergraduate. So a lot of us come in with almost sometimes more undergraduate debt, if you can imagine, than the professional debt on top of that, right? And many times residencies also, you can't really get deferment of loans during that time, so that's another thing to think about. So it depends, of course, on the residency and what you're doing and and where your loans are from too. But anyway, it's just something to think about, and where we have a big increase in funding for DVM PhD programs that I've seen, which is great, and really essential. I think the whole MSTP model is essential also to kind of get thinking along those lines. But we have to also address the fact that students are also coming in even to professional programs with loads of debt. So I think the loan repayment programs that the NIH has are great. They're also more suited to very specific research areas, of course, which would be the other thing that I think, I know, right, money is always limited for everybody, so you have to, as people have been saying, you have to choose where it goes. But maybe increasing loan repayment programs, for veterinary researchers that aren't just for specific research fields that are very, kind of a little bit more exclusive, I guess. So those are my that's sort of my background, and I really think that it's important to educate people from the high school level on, and I know we've heard about that as well. But I think that these cross-disciplinary training programs are anything that we can do to involve students from as early as possible to at least increase awareness and buy-in too, because there's as we've all been hearing about all these barriers between the different fields and all the silos, and especially from the basic science standpoint, there's a lot of times in basic science labs, especially if you get more and more molecular, they just don't understand anything about medicine or how to. It's more of just like kind of a model for the science rather than a driver, which is fine in some respects, but there are big, huge barriers that, at least in my experience, that they're totally separate, different worlds from where I came from. That it's kind of like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, when they really shouldn't be, as we've all seen. So I think in order to start breaking those barriers, you've got to increase research, the exposure for veterinary students to research. I think that's really important, but also on a societal basis, to increase awareness in high schools. That's just all the way up through undergraduate experience. And I think the best way to do this is targeted to science, kids interested in science, and then having programs talked about with integrating kids that are interested in different areas of science, and then having them do these problem-based learning approaches where it's like a 2-week-long camp or something, and they meet other kids who are interested in, medical sciences and the sciences, and then they have this role play where they, play the role of the veterinarian or the MD or the environmental scientists or the ecologist, and then they all come together. They have to solve this problem, and it's guided learning and that sort of thing. And I think teaching sort of knowledge of what more of a liberal arts kind of perspective of what the different fields do and are capable of doing from a very early age is would really help out to sort of get the framework going, and then all the other efforts that are so critical for increasing exposure to research in veterinary school and at the residency level as well are essential. And I did, several of my cohort mates did want to mention, one of the big advantages of the UW training program is actually that we have pretty big, strong emphasis on research with the as part of the lab animal training program. So we do really encourage, we had to have a first author. Of course, there's the requirement for the first author publication, but there's almost everybody coming out gets at least a master's. And so there's, I've heard feedback from the other residents that being involved in a basic research project, where many of them were much more clinically oriented, but they were forced to be involved in a basic research project, and they were really glad about that. So they were really opened their eyes, whereas before they saw themselves more as a supporting role, even if they don't end up going into like a direct research role themselves, being involved in a basic research project was really kind of life-changing for a lot of them and a really valuable experience. So I think that sort of speaks a lot to that.
Hi. So we were given a list of questions to try to answer. I'll start just by introducing myself and answering the question about what training programs I have been or am currently associated with. I'd also be interested, just for my own information from the panel, if you talk about your appointments and your percentages of effort. I'm just interested in that from a career perspective, since I don't actually have a job yet. So I am a current CIRCA awardee. I have a KO1. I am a research assistant professor at NC State University, North Carolina State, with a 100% research appointment is my description, and fully focused on my KO1 research in a nutrical biology lab. I am a long career track, so DVM and then internship residency training. I'm an equine internist by training, boarded ACVIM large animal, and then went from residency training to the T32, which at our institution is a PhD program. And so the T32 funded the first 3 years of my PhD, and through very good mentorship advice, I was on top of my funding situation, and so was awarded the KO1 a year before my PhD training or so ended, and so rolled right into that funding at the end of the T32 to finish out my PhD, and have completed that. As far as other program participation, the NIH Mariel program I did when I was after my sophomore year in veterinary school in 2003. So those are the programs I've participated in. We were also asked to emphasize the methods used to enhance the function of the interdisciplinary teams in the programs we've participated in, and so I would say my experience has been excellent in terms of it's just that interdisciplinary aspect has been just part of the culture of the faculty that were part of my graduate program. My committee members were very diverse basic scientists, as well as veterinarians. The research seminar participation, having to present. Our T32 is linked to the Center for Comparative Medicine Translational Research Training Program at NC State. So that program has its own requirements in terms of annual presentation of project progress, internal funding opportunities, so the opportunity to write at least 2 pilot grants during my first and second year of PhD training. So I feel like already thinking about funding and grant writing was very upfront in my PhD training, which I think has benefited me as I've moved through my career stages. And then wonderful access to other institutions. So at NC State, we're very lucky that we have 2 medical schools nearby. UNC Chapel Hill and Duke are both within a 30-mile radius, and the collaborations are well established among investigators at the vet school, and then some at Duke and some at UNC. And so my mentor, Sam Jones, is just excellent at all stages, saying the importance of creating interdisciplinary mentorship. And so I have an MD from UNC who is on my co-mentorship team for my KO1, as well as a basic scientist, both RO1 funded. So, I've gotten that aspect through really strong and good mentorship advice. So I'll leave it there for now. We'll see where the discussion goes.
Hi, I'm Tracy Baker from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm just starting my 3rd year on a KO1 award. I'm similar to you in that I'm 100% research. Basically, I'm an assistant scientist, so a full research track. Also looking for employment. But I still have 3 more years of funding, and so I'm good with that. I actually use zebrafish as a model for studying exposure to environmental toxicants, so I appreciate Dr. Kent's plug for zebrafish earlier. As far as training programs that I've been involved with, I think that the NIH mentored research, the T32 program within the veterinary schools is very great for training veterinary scientists. I didn't actually take part in that, but a lot of people did, and I think that was kind of where I saw what else you could do with the veterinary degree before I thought research was kind of, only lab animal, and so through that program, I was able to see kind of a lot of the other areas that you could go into. After graduating from veterinary school, I actually I became part of the Molecular and Environmental Toxicology Center. So my PhD wasn't associated with the veterinary school, and I was actually the first DVM to go through that program. They were able to get funding for me through the NIEHS T32 program. It's their postdoctoral. So I was kind of a postdoc getting my PhD, which was kind of a strange, place to be in. But that gave me 2 years of funding, and so then I actually needed more. I had to get funding through my mentors for my last 2 years of my PhD, and then I actually heard about the KO1 after vet school. So kind of what you were saying is that I didn't know about the KO1 program during veterinary school. So then once learning about it, I applied, and then that's helped me kind of finish my PhD and then kind of where I am right now. The other program on campus is our ICTR Center, which is the Institute for Clinical and Translational Research. It's the CTSA, and they have just recently, they allow KO1 recipients to kind of become part of their KL2 Scholars Program, and they have a whole center of seminars and monthly meetings between veterinary scholars and vet med and human medicine scholars, and so that's been nice as far as having that crossover. As far as the successful aspects of these programs that I've been involved in, I think like you said, the crossover of disciplines and the interaction between trainers and mentors from all these different areas has been really great. I don't feel like, as far as University of Wisconsin, One Health hasn't been formally incorporated into a lot of those things, even though I think that we're poised because we have the med school, the vet school, a pharmacy school, a nursing school, public health, and global health. We have all of these programs that are there, and everyone, there's MDs, DVMs, in all of these places. But I think that it could really, use something, whether it's a different training program or some way of kind of incorporating, them together under the One Health umbrella. And I think that a lot of that would have to do kind of with what has been said here already, just educating. There's a lot of people, my mentors are both basic scientists, and when I told them I was coming to this One Health thing, neither of them know what One Health was. So I kind of had to, talk them through it. And again, like a lot of people have said, it made perfect sense once, you talked about it, and, they're doing One Health. They just didn't realize that. And I think, in the MD community, there's a lot of that as well. So I think just getting the word out and, making people aware of what that is and what's being done would be a great thing. Also, DVM PhD programs, like people have said, would be very beneficial. Having gone through a long road to get those things, loan repayment is another huge thing, which we've already talked about. So I think that's all I have.
Good morning. My name is Pierre Comitsoli, and I always like to call myself a research veterinarian working at the National Zoo that belongs to the Smithsonian Institution. So my background is a little bit different than yours because I'm coming from France, as you can tell from my accent, and I got my DVM more than 20 years ago. And I can tell you that at that time, the way the veterinary cursus was built, we had absolutely no exposure to science or to interdisciplinary approaches. But I was lucky enough at that time to meet at some point a mentor who told me, you should maybe think after the vet school, to do a master and maybe a PhD. So that's I worked as a practitioner, and then after that, I I did my master and my PhD again in France. And also the big difference that we have also with you in the United States is that we don't have to pay to go to school. You just need to have parents who are accepting for you to stay home and to feed you, and so that's it. So then, after the PhD, I worked a couple of years at the Natural History Museum in Paris, and because the funding situation and really the for science was really poor, I decided to move to the United States. And I really opened a really new chapter in my professional career, because I arrived in a place where veterinarians could definitely do really interesting things that were absolutely impossible to do in Europe. And after just a couple of years at the Smithsonian, I was told by my colleagues at that time from my lab, who already had received the KO1 Circa awards, that I should apply to that. So we worked on that together, and that's really where I received this kind of, the first training really was, writing the proposal and assemble, the team of people from, different areas and disciplines. And also what was interesting is that, so I received the KO1, so I was covered by the KO1 Circa from 2005 to 2010. And now when I think of it, I was working with, I was absolutely not working on pathogens, or I was really working on fertility preservation, so more physiology. But I was working with medical doctors, I was working with different specialists, and actually I was doing One Health without knowing it. So now I think, yes, One Health was already there. It was not called really One Health, but it was really part of the training. And I think it was really good because again, intellectually, it was really satisfying. And of course, receiving, so you say you're looking for a job, but I was also like you looking for a job. So that what I did, actually, I wrote an R01 and to try to stay a little bit longer in my lab, and it worked because you receive, the training from the KO1. It's supposed to be the path for independence, and actually that, in my case, it worked pretty well. And so I keep doing basically more or less the same types of research, but it's again really comparative and integrative also, and multidisciplinary. So it's exactly what I was hoping to do, and I think now listening to the different talks, I think it's great because we are definitely speaking the same language, and I think we are addressing really big societal issue or planetary issues, and I think it's really exciting to be part of that. But I realize also that maybe because veterinary now the young DVMs are maybe more exposed to this type of experience than MDs, and I've been working with. So now I'm trying to give back to NIH and to my colleagues, to the young veterinarians also, and. I've been part of a program called Zoo Ubiquity with Barbara Natterson, who's a cardiologist at UCLA, and she's a medical doctor, and she's really the one who's always surprised that young MD students, sometimes they have no idea that some pathologies are really similar in animals than in human. So she started that program to try to mix together the two communities, which is kind of interesting. And but also I have also a lot of interns coming to my lab now, and most of those interns, they want to go to vet school, and they stay sometimes with me for a year. They are paid interns, by the way. They're not. They don't stay for free, but they have, the opportunity to do a research project, and to be exposed really to science and to different types of disciplines, and then they successfully go to vet school. Some of them, after vet school, they came back to do a postdoc with me in the lab. So I think it's really great. And again, I think we have to realize that this is really a situation that's really happening in the United States, and I know that in Europe, at least in France, still doesn't happen, which is a shame. And just to finish, I think also the concept, the way I said yes, I was doing One Health without noticing it, but to me, and I was meeting with the One Health Club at the Colorado State University last week, and I told them that One Health is not only about pathology or parasites, it's also about animal welfare. It's also, physiology, fertility preservation. I mean, everything related to really whatever we have in common between human and animals, the fact that we share the same environment. And I think it's really exciting, actually. And I like to have this slide with the big umbrella of One Health because, yes, we need to have this kind of a global view. That's it.
Hey, so my name is Rob Rabune, currently medical oncologist at UC Davis. I thought that I would, I got the list of questions, and I thought I would just kind of run through my story quickly and where the training programs came in, because I think that my story is a little bit different, although it's not unique. I think just kind of highlighting the kind of pitfalls that I ran into and kind of how or who threw me lifelines throughout that period of training. And then also kind of stressing some of the mentorship that I got along the way. So I started vet school. I was most interested in dairy medicine. I wanted a truck and I wanted to drive around the country. And I don't know what happened, but I usually, in the whole vet school dynamics of the lecture hall, I sat in the back left-hand corner with the baseball hat with the dairy folks. And the DVM PhD, the two DVM PhD students were up here in the front. So I didn't get too much interaction with them, but I did, as far as, One Health in the program at Cornell, it wasn't necessarily front and center, but it was there. And so one of the first things that got me thinking about that was a project that I did with Patrick McDonough there, who was in the GI enteric lab, microbiology, and I got to go collect fecal samples from cows, and then we came back and we looked at enrichment protocols for looking at E. coli 0157. So, definitely some One Health there. Looking at foodborne illness but actually being in the field. And then I ran into Dr. Bud Tennant, who did woodchuck hepatitis virus research, and I was really kind of excited for some reason about that. At the same time in the Cornell curriculum, Rod Page actually came to Cornell and opened up the oncology service, and so I was in this internal struggle between dairy cows and interest in oncology, but ultimately the oncology won out. And in looking at going into the cancer field, I actually became most interested in research again through a little 2-week rotation through Bud Tennant's lab, and decided I was just going to go for it. I was going to apply for a PhD program after vet school. And I applied to a bunch of programs, and one of the ones that kind of caught my eye was MD Anderson. I was interested in metastasis, and I kept reading these review articles by Josh Fidler down at MD Anderson, and one of them happened to have DVM after it, and I thought, well, that's interesting. So I applied to MD Anderson, and ultimately went down, interviewed with Josh Fidler, who, if anybody's ever met him, is quite a character. But when I came back and I remember talking to Bud Tennant about my decision, and I thought, well, it might be safe to just stay in the veterinary environment. I feel a little bit more comfortable, and but MD Anderson was a great place, and he really kind of encouraged me through telling me kind of his story of how he became successful, and I think he essentially forced me to go outside of my comfort zone, and ultimately I went to MD Anderson, and I think that was quite scary for me going into a big, huge research lab as being a veterinarian. I at least had the safety net of the PI at the lab was a veterinarian, so I felt like there was that support, but I was the only one there, and I was surrounded by fellows and MDs that, we'd have conversations at the lab bench about, yes, dogs get cancer. And so I was used to all of those things while I was doing my research training. So it really was submersion. There was absolutely nothing veterinary as far as my research training went. The only thing was at that time I was married, had one child, and so income was definitely an issue. Instead of, when I talked to Josh Fiddler about applying for funding, he said, no, don't worry about it. I said, well, I need to make more money. And he said, then go work. So I worked at an emergency clinic on the weekends to help kind of pay for that. And so as I finished up that PhD training, I was there 4 years. And one of the things that I liked about that lab is Josh Fiddler said when I first got there, he said, you will be done in 4 years. Whether or not you have a PhD, that's up to you. So it was a little bit distressing, but I did finish up the PhD, and at that time I decided to harass Rod Page again about opportunities, because I really felt at that point I was at a crossroads, and I actually probably didn't plan it very well, in that I thought, well, when I get done with a PhD and I'm a veterinarian, I'm going to be able to get a job in academia. And I guess I never really thought about it, but it just was in my head. And then when I got to that point, I said, well, I have to either decide. I have to either go clinical or I have to go and do a postdoc. And I was worried, quite honestly, that if I went into a straight postdoc, that I would I would lose that advantage of having a PhD. And essentially would be competing with other PhD students or straight PhDs for postdoc, faculty position, those sorts of things. But I still had a clinical interest, and one of the things that very fortunately at that point in time is Rod Page directed me towards Colorado State and their program, and I contacted them. David Vale, Stephen Withrow were there at the time. And through a few conversations, they were very interested in training, what Withrow would call the triple threat, which is a board-certified, residency-trained DVM PhD. And I think they had gotten money through Morris Animal Foundation. Rod can correct me later if I'm wrong, but through that foundation to train residency or DVMs into the PhD program in cancer biology there. And so what they did is I went up there and met with them, and they were excited to have me join, and kind of showed a little bit of flexibility in that training program, and their end goal was to train a DVM PhD that was residency trained. And so having me coming in a little bit out of their order, they were willing to be flexible and say, okay, we're gonna go ahead and offer you a residency program for 2 years. It'll be, that was the minimum at that time that you had to have. You're on 100% of the time. You worry about studying for boards, but we're going to put you through this program. And so for me, that was tremendous because, number one, that was what I wanted to do. Number two, at that time, I had 2 kids, and one on the third on the way. And for us, from the family side of things, knowing where I was going and being able to have those conversations with my wife was very important. And the reason why I bring that up is that I see that as a pitfall with many of the DVM PhD students that I see coming through. They may be married, they have families. To go into the VIRMP, the residency matching program, they have no idea where they may end up for an internship, and then the same thing for a residency. And it's very challenging. And one of the pitfalls that I see where people really are limited in location, and then they can't apply, or there are limited applications in the residency matching program. Where I see that is successful in many cases is through some of the other specialties that may not go through that. So radiology, pathology, there's a little bit more flexibility in that individuals can kind of know where they need to go. But I just bring that up because I do see that as a pitfall with some of the folks that are coming up through now. So I was able to do the residency program in 2 years, and then applying for faculty positions. At that point, I had the DVM PhD and residency. And I think, for me, it was important that I was able to do, although I did them separately, I did the PhD in 4 years, and I did the residency program in 2 years. And so looking for faculty positions, the biggest focus at that point in time was the CERCA. The K Award for me, in looking at faculty positions, I wanted to identify a place. So there were many oncology jobs at that point in time. I wanted to identify the place that would best position me to get a K. And so ultimately, UC Davis ended up being that. Shinbin Chen was there, who's the mentor on my K Award. So I'm a little bit, I think, unique from the rest of the group in that I had a faculty position at Davis, and at that time, that's when I applied for the K Award. But it's been a tremendous, I'm now in my 4th year, I'll be going into my 5th year of that K, and it's been a tremendous boost for me. It allowed me to drop from a 50% clinical commitment to a 25% clinical commitment, allowing me to focus more on research. I just got tenure last year, and I think that the K was instrumental in helping me do that. And now my focus is on trying to get some R01s out. And then my one little spiel, if I have a second left, is, and I've agreed with almost everything that everybody said here, and the importance and the pitfalls of training veterinarians. I think that one of the things that I just want to point out while I've got the microphone is I hear a lot about MD, PhD programs versus the DVM PhD programs, and I think that recognizing the differences between those two programs and the challenges between those two are very important, and I think that NIH has done a good job at that, but just kind of pointing out that, and we've heard this, but just to put it in a different way, I think the DVM students, when they separate from the pack and go into the PhD training or whatever it is, eventually when they come back, and I don't mean to make this a total pack mentality discussion, but when they come back and they look at their peers, when they get towards the end of that training, the end of the DVM, many of our students are out in practice, getting jobs, starting families right away. As opposed to, if you look at the medical school side, the medical students are planning on several years. They know going into medical school that there's several years of training beyond medical school. And so they've got an internship. They may have residency for, anywhere from, I think, 3 to 6 or more years. And then they may be doing a fellowship. And so if you're looking at your classmate alongside of you, and you're seeing that, well, yeah, they've got, they're 6 years, 5 years from actually making any money and paying off student loans as well, versus, 3 out of the 4 people next to me are going out into practice, starting families next week, whereas I'm talking about spending another 7 years. I think that is one of the biggest pitfalls, and where we lose a lot of people is right up at that end point. That's it.
Thanks, everyone. So I think we've heard a lot of sort of consistency and the inconsistency, which is that everybody seems to have gotten to a certain point in a different way with respect to advanced training. And my story is, I'll just keep it short, is fairly similar, that I graduated from vet school, never really occurred to me to do research, wanted to be in private practice, and was in practice for a couple years and became really sort of enamored with the fact that there was cancer everywhere, and found it really intriguing, and ended up doing a residency in medical oncology in Wisconsin. And this sort of, again, points to the importance of mentors that can really grab you and force you to think of things in a different way. And I think all of us have been driven by those individual mentors that have sort of spurred us on to pursue a career in science. I had a mentor when I was in my residency who had noted in the literature the recent description of mutations in a gene called KIT in human mastocytoma, as well as some mouse mast cell lines. And we see a lot of that disease in dogs. And he had come to me and said, we really need to look at that. And I had said, no, I don't want to. And he said, yes, we do. And so I said, well, okay. And so we we decided to do some very rudimentary things, but one of the things that he had me do was really do a literature search and see, which was not easy back then because PubMed wasn't there. And so we found a great mentor at Harvard named Steve Galley, who was a mast cell guy and really didn't work in the field of malignant mast cell disease, but we called him up, and he was sort of the second mentor who drove me to pursue a career in research, which he essentially said, yeah, this is really cool. Why don't you come to my lab and see if these dog tumors have these mutations? And so he supported my being in his lab for a month. And so I went to Boston, worked in his lab, and we found mutations in the KIT gene there. And I think that was sort of one of those serendipitous moments where I went from saying, I have no interest in doing this, to saying, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And so I finished my residency off and decided, based on that experience and being at the bench, that I wanted to do a PhD, and went to Harvard to work in his lab, and ultimately found that it probably wasn't the best graduate training lab, and ended up in a basic cellular immunology lab, which was a great graduate experience. And one of the really important components in a training program is the ability to critically review the literature, to read papers, to write papers, and to learn to write grants. And I think that's one of the critical things that we need to make sure is included in our DVM PhD training, because you can do the best research in the world, but if you can't write a good grant that is read well and accepted and is innovative and catches the reviewer's attention, then it doesn't matter what you're doing. And so that, I think, needs to be something that we incorporate in all of our training programs, and get our trainees to practice writing grants, to write their own K awards. And so when I was in my PhD training, my mentor knew nothing about the K awards, and I actually learned about it from a fellow resident who had a K01 award. So one of the themes here is that most of us really weren't aware of those K awards, and it was somebody else who brought them to our attention. So I think we need to make that more visible as a means of advanced training. And so I was successful in getting that, and it transitioned me into my first faculty position at UC Davis. And then I subsequently left there and have been at Ohio State for 10 years. But one of the things that the K Award enabled me to do was to, again, transition to my first faculty position. It was very useful leveraging that, but it also helped prepare me to write my first R01, which wasn't funded, and then the next one wasn't, and then the next one was. So to transition that into a successful research career. But it's also helped prepare me to be a mentor. And so I've now graduated 4 DVM PhD candidates, and actually all of them have been residency PhD candidates. So we've sort of chosen to train those people in my lab who are in a residency program, and 2 of them have successfully gotten K awards as well, and transitioned those into future careers. So I think some of the lessons learned here are that the mentors have been really critical, and that none of us really were aware of the training options, the K award option, and if we had been aware of that, it certainly would have been useful probably a little earlier in our careers to help us along, because there was a lot of delay in getting those. But that we all sort of arrived at the same point in a very different way, and got to where we are in a different way. Anything else to add? Any questions? Oh, wow.
Yeah, thanks for your perspective. I'm Nick Kenyon from UC Davis. I've been the director of our T32 in the CTSA for about 8 years, and we've always had DVM PhDs in there who've basically been the stars. In fact, Amber Roger, who we heard about at Oregon State, we funded for a while. So I think you illustrate well the different pathways that you need, because development's obviously very different for trainees. One group that we do have in the CTSA T32 is medical students who are on a 1-year option. They're often taking 1 year out of medical school for either get a master's of clinical research or to spend 90% of the time in the lab. I think the option is there for a lot of them. The motivation might be they're trying to get into ophthalmology or dermatology, something very competitive. But for some, it makes a huge difference. They decide that they really like research and they make an academic career out of it. One group that I don't see an awful lot are veterinary students who want to take 1 year. And I think that does have some value, because not everybody wants to do a PhD at that time frame. I want to know if you know any barriers or any groups of vet students who would be interested in 1 year.
I think that the challenge, as sort of we all have stated is getting them out for a year is that they don't often like to interrupt their training. And so I don't think it's been a program, that sort of program that's been taken up by many of them. It's offered to them, but it's very hard to get them to interrupt that sort of rush of didactic training that they have in their first 3 years. Yes.
Ted Mashima, I'll just use the acronym this time, AAVMC. Cheryl, you brought up the 1-year interruption with the medical science training program. And I'm going to just say that the NIH actually is listening and has heard that concern, and they've adjusted it such that they are trying to figure out a way for you to do it 1 year after you finish the degree. And I'm bringing this up specifically because when this community has raised concerns to the NIH, they do want veterinary engagement, and they have adjusted a program. Whether or not it can still fly, we have to work out some details, but it's just the receptivity. Dr. Mills indicated, that she's now a champion, so we'll knock on her door a little bit more. And ORIP has requested our input on different things, so I just want to encourage when they give those opportunities for us to provide input that we do so. And there's ongoing process in their current strategic plan evaluation. So thanks.
Hi, Sabina Hlavate. I'm a postbac here at the NCI. So I actually am very interested in clinical veterinary research, and I know we've heard throughout today that a lot of these training programs seem to have a lot of people coming through who are doing basic biomedical research. And I was just wondering what kind of training opportunities are there, whether through dual degree programs or even at veterinary, just the strict veterinary programs, for people to get exposure and training for a career in clinical veterinary research.
So I would say there's not any sort of great formalized training program for clinical veterinary research. And, because I run our clinical trials office, I see the enormous gaps in our clinicians' ability to formalize clinical research, to understand how to formulate a hypothesis, how to statistically power your study so it's appropriate, how to have objectives that are meaningful and realistic. And so it's a huge gap in our training is to take clinicians who have questions they'd like to answer in the clinical setting and train them to do that in a meaningful, structured manner. It's something we're working on at Ohio State. There is a formalized training program at Ohio State for MDs to do clinician scientist work and to learn how to do clinical research. But there hasn't been anything that I'm aware of with respect to a formalized clinical research training program in veterinary medicine. I think it would be enormously useful, maybe as a master's degree even.
Could I comment on that?
Yeah.
Could I say something? I'm over here. Anyway.
Sorry.
I come from McMaster University, which is the home of evidence-based medicine. They had a lot of clinical investigators. And one of the great paths into clinical research was basic research, because they totally understood the biology, they had questions of their own, and then they developed a different set of skills in clinical research. The flip side was you get trained in, let's say, superficial aspects of experimental design, and it's like, give me a question, I'll help you answer it. So actually a core in basic research is one of the great paths to clinical research, because you'll have your disease and organs of interest, and then you'll be able to go on from there.
And I just want to add real quick, to answer that question, I mean, the residency programs, many of them do have masters associated with them. I think some of them are better than others, depending on what that master's is. But it's difficult to have any kind of a real, true basic research component during a residency program. Most of them are just too time-consuming. There are a couple programs for junior faculty. Anyway, UC Davis has a couple opportunities for junior faculty to train. There is a master's program. I can't remember what number that is, but I think it's through the CTSA, and then the K-12s as well through there. So there are opportunities for junior faculty that don't have basic research background to get trained in clinical research.
Okay, we'll have to end it here. We now have a break, 10:40 to 11. But do keep in mind we have a session where we'll have more chance to ask these questions after that break. So hold your questions and remember them.